Hey, I'm Charles, and today we've got our KLR650 in the shop. We're adding some of our favorite accessories to this to get it ready for some adventure rides. And today we're going to show you how to install the Thermo-Bob 2 on your KLR. Now, if you're new to the KLR community and you don't know what that is, basically you're adding a coolant bypass line. Now, the reason you want that is some of the KLRs have a hard time warming up in cooler temperatures, and the bypass line allows coolant flow or some coolant flow around your engine parts before the thermostat opens up, and that way you're going to have quicker warm-up times and you get a more consistent cooling temperature throughout, which helps promote a longer engine life. Now, on the 2022 KLR 650s, they actually don't come with a temperature gauge, and the 2A kit comes with that. So if that's what you're looking to do, this is a great way to do it. Now, the install process will be similar for your Gen 1, 2, and 3 KLRs, but there might be some minor differences from machine to machine, so make sure you refer to the instructions that came with your kit. For parts, you can either get the Thermo-Bob 2 or the Thermo-Bob 2A. This kit we have right here, this is the Thermo-Bob 2A, and the difference is this one comes with the temperature gauge. So the 2A kit is geared towards the 22 and newer models of KLR 650s, and the regular 2 is geared for anything else that already has a gauge in the dash. Now, with that being said, if your bike's a few years old and you're replacing this stuff, you want to install new coolant when you go back together. To do this job, you're going to need common hand tools. A few things I want to point out are our torque wrench. We've got a hook tool for the radiator hoses. We have some zip ties. You need a razor blade to cut the radiator hoses. And then you also want to have safety glasses and rubber gloves since you're dealing with coolant. To start out, we need to gain access to the right side of the engine. So for us, we need to remove our crash bar. We've got our fairing and our skid plate. If you have frame sliders, you're going to want to remove those as well. Now, the process to remove all this stuff might look a little bit different for your machine depending on what generation of KLR you have. Now, if you're working on a 2022 model and haven't had this stuff off yet, some of these plastic covers are held in by some grommets. And this grommet actually came out with this piece. Stick that back in. Now that we have all the fasteners removed from our fairing, on the front of these 2022s, they've got 2 rubber grommets, and you're just going to pull this straight out. Now, before you drain the coolant, you want to make sure your working surfaces are clean. So by the drain plug, up by the thermostat housing, and our coolant hose. Now, if you have a new bike or you already have fresh coolant in your bike and you want to reuse it, you want to make sure you have a completely spotless container to drain it into. So I'm going to remove that plug. And I'm going to go up top and break free the radiator cap. Now you can wipe off the sealing surface. I'm going to replace this crush washer as well. We'll thread the drain plug in, and we're going to torque this to 5.7 foot-pounds. Now, up by the thermostat housing, I'm going to place a rag underneath to catch any spilled coolant. And I'm going to use an 8mm socket. We'll remove these 3 bolts. Now we can pull the thermostat housing back. We're going to remove this stock thermostat. Next, we have the big O-ring that came in the kit. That's going to sit where the old thermostat or stock thermostat was. Then we've got our 2A housing, but if you just have the Thermo-Bob 2 housing, it's going to sit in the same orientation. So this fitting is going to be facing towards the front of the bike and down just a little bit. And then we're going to install the new thermostat. So you have these wings on the sides, and to make sure it clears that temp sensor, we need to have these wings so they're in line with that left side bolt hole. You want to make sure that the sealing surface on this stock elbow is clean. And as long as that's good, we'll just set that onto our new housing. We're going to use one of the 3 supplied bolts. Make sure the O-ring stays in place, and then we're going to thread this onto the side of the cylinder. And then once you have all 3 bolts started by hand, you're just going to turn them each a couple turns at a time, and we're going to compress all this stuff together evenly. Once you have the bolts lightly seated, you want to go back through with your torque wrench and torque these to 5.7 foot-pounds. Next step is to remove this radiator hose. This is the one that's further back on the pump housing. To break that free, sometimes you can twist them, but this one, it's kind of stuck, so I'm going to use my hook tool. And then the other side of that hose is going into the left radiator, so we'll just disconnect it there. And now we can pull it straight out. Now with the radiator hose on the bench, we have this protective cover, and there's just a little bit of sealant on this one end we need to break free because we need to slide this cover down. So this is the end that goes to the water pump. This other end is the one going into the radiator, and right here is where we're going to install our T. So we'll go ahead, take our screwdriver and break that adhesive loose. So the other side came apart pretty easy, but on this side, it's on there pretty good. And as you're working that free, just make sure you don't puncture the radiator hose. So now that we're freed up, we're gonna slide this sleeve down to this elbow or the corner that connects to the water pump. And we can slide this back up once we've made our connection. The next step is to splice the T into our radiator hose. Again, we're doing this on the section that ties into the radiator. Now, with the T, you want to have this centered up on this flat section right here, and then we're going to remove a 5/8 inch piece out of the middle. So I'm just using a paint pen to mark this section that we need to remove. That's going to be the raised section on the T. You can use a tape measure to verify that it's 5/8 of an inch. Then we're going to use our razor blade and cut straight through on each of the dots. And before I cut this all the way off, just kind of pay attention to the curves of this whole thing, because you're going to be able to rotate this once it's on that T. So now we can take the bigger hose clamps. We'll install them onto each end of that hose we just cut. Then we'll install the T, and this fitting is going to face towards the water pump. Now before you tighten the clamps down, you want to make sure everything's in the correct position. So one thing you can do is mock this up on the bike and make sure you have everything where it needs to be. So one tip for you, the curve where this goes down into the water pump, if this is going straight up, the start right before the bend in your T fitting, this part right here, that's going to be on that same plane, or it's going to be parallel with this hose going down into the water pump. So again, mock it up on the bike, then you can tighten these down, and we've got this smaller hose that's going to go on top. Slide the hose clamp on it, and then you can tighten this down, and we'll bring this over to the bike. Now to install the hose assembly, we're going to do that from the left-hand side of the bike. And as you route this, keep in mind that the larger hose goes underneath that clutch cable, and then the smaller hose just goes up towards the Thermo-Bob. Now that you have the hose in place, you want to verify that you have the T-fitting exactly where you want it. If you need to make adjustments, go ahead and do that. Once you've made your adjustments, then you'll want to install the 2 clamps on the ends of the radiator hose. Now up by the Thermo-Bob housing, just behind it, you'll see there's a little hole, and that is the vent or the drain for your spark plug. So anytime you're changing that out, you want to use compressed air and blow that out. So the reason I'm telling you that is you don't want to cover it up with this hose clamp. So the big end of the hose clamp, or the side with the screw, we're going to have that facing down. So I'm going to slide that onto that smaller hose. And then from here, you want to determine if you need to trim this up at all. So if you stick this onto the fitting on the Thermo-Bob, And if it's poking out too far and getting too close to your exhaust, you want to trim that up. So you just want it to be the shortest length possible. And ours is looking pretty good. So I'm just going to go ahead and slide this clamp up and tighten it down. The next step is to wire up our temperature gauge. Now, if you don't have one of these, you can skip forward in the video and you can bleed your cooling system and get that topped off. But for us, what we need to do is run the wires for this from the sensor. We're gonna follow some of the stock cables all the way up to the head stay. And as you do that, you want to avoid any pinch points, hot spots, or anything that could damage the wires. Now, to mount up your temp gauge, you can pretty much put this wherever you want it, and your mounting options are some double-sided tape, or they provide mounting hardware as well. We're using the mounting hardware, and they actually give you a template to use with that. So we're gonna use this, and this template, we're just gonna place this underneath this LCD. I put tape in the upper corners to help hold it in the right spot. Then from here, we're gonna follow our template, get our holes drilled out, and then mount up the gauge. Nice. The next step is to refill your cooling system. Now for us, we're going to be using engine ice. So with that, we flush the system and we're going to be replacing the fluid in that cooling reservoir as well. Now a few tips with this. If you don't have a flex funnel like we do, you're going to remove the left side fairing. And when you pour the coolant in, you want to pour it in slow, and that's going to help any air bubbles come to the top. And the last thing, once we have this filled up, we're going to squeeze one of the radiator hoses. And again, that's going to help bubbles come to the top. Now, if you wanted to measure the coolant out, you can measure out 37 ounces and make sure it all goes in. And if not all of it goes in, you can run the engine for 30 seconds, get some of those bubbles out to pour the rest in. But I've just topped it off, and then I'm going to reinstall this radiator cap. We're going to run it for 2 to 3 minutes. You're going to want to do this even if you got all 37 ounces in there. And we're going to make sure our gauge reads at least 200 degrees. Now, if you have an older KLR, just make sure you're up to operating temperature. Then shut the engine off, let the bike cool down, and once everything is cool, you're going to double check the level in your radiator, make sure that's topped off, and then also the cooling reservoir. Now keep in mind, when you run the machine, you want to do that in a well-ventilated area. And as the bike is running, just glance around and make sure you don't have any coolant leaks. Now that the bike is cooled down, we've double checked our cooling levels and those are looking good. So from here we can reinstall our fairings and the accessories we previously removed. And that's how you install the Thermo-Bob 2 on your KLR650. If you need one of these kits, they're available on our website, so go pick one of those up. And if you have any questions, leave those down in the comments below. Now, if you like this video, give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. I'm Charles with Rocky Mountain ATV MC. Thanks for watching.